Alright, so now we want to work with the weighted averages worksheet. And from reading in the text, you should have noticed a formula to find a weighted average. So let me write this down for you. Right. Alright, so you should have had sigma, right? And we're adding up, so we're taking all the individual weights, right? So weight sub k, and then multiplying it by its appropriate x value, right? And then dividing that by the sum of my weights, right? So this is one way to write it with sigma notation, or you can see at the top of the worksheet, this is another way to write it out, right? So where for example, the subscripts 1 go together, right? So the weight for the data point 1, right? We multiply those, and then we look up the weight and the appropriate data value for the second value, right? Multiply those and go all the way until we reach the end of our data point, right? N, and then we will divide by the sum of all the weights, right? So in this worksheet, there's let's see, four different examples of using weighted averages, right? So the first one is, number 1 says you buy 8 children's tickets at $5 a piece and 2 adult tickets at $12 a piece. What is the average price per ticket, right? So this is an example of of weighted averages, right? So you want to be able to identify what the weight is here. So the weight here, the weights would be 8 and 2, right? The number of children's tickets, right? So if I wanted to find the average price per ticket, I could use this formula. So if I take the first weight, which is 8, and I multiply it by that data point, which is $5, right? And then I add it to, and then I look at the next weight. So the next weight would be 2 adult tickets, and then I can multiply that times that data point, which would be $12 a piece, right? And then divide this by the sum of the weights, right? So that would be 8 plus 2, right? We just have 2 data points in this case. So if I make sure you follow order of operations, right? But if I simplify this, right? So if I bring up my calculator, right? So to enter this in, right? If we open up a parenthesis, we could do 8 times 5 plus 2 times 12. All this divided by 8 plus 2. Right? So we get 6.4, which we're talking about in terms of money. So it would be $6.40. Right, so this would be the average price spent per ticket. Right. And then part B asks, what are the weights in the weighted average problem? Right, so we already told you this. It was 8 and 2. Right, were the weights. Right, so then number 2, so it says your grade consists of a test worth 80% and a paper worth 20%. You get a 70 on the test and 100 on the paper. What grade do you get in the course, right? So I actually think it's helpful to do part B first by identifying what the weights are. So the weights in this particular problem would be the 80% and the 20%, right? So depending on what we get on the test and the paper, these are the values that put a weight on calculating this in your grade, right? So the test is worth much more than a paper, right? So if we want to calculate the grade that we got in a course, we could still follow the same formula, right? So we take the first weight, which is 80%, multiply that times the data value for the first, so 70, right? And then add the next weight times that data value, which was 100, and then we divide by the sum of the weights, right? So 80% plus 20%. Right? So if we simplify this, right? So we would have 0.8, right? Because that's 80% times 70 plus 0.2 times 100. Then this would be divided by 0.8 plus 0.2. We get 76. Right, so the grade you would get in the class would be a 76. Right, so just because you got 100 on the paper, that didn't have a big emphasis, right? Only 20%. So number 3 is a similar example. It says, now assume that you have that there are 2 exams worth 40% and a paper worth 20%, right? You get a 60 on the midterm and 100 on the paper. What is your current grade at this point in the course, right? So I'll just make some notes to decide, right? So we have exam 1, we have exam 2, and a paper. Right, so exam 1 is 40%, exam 2 is 40%, and the paper is worth 20%. Right, so we have this, like this table would be in the syllabus, right, to show the emphasis. So we want to calculate the current grade at this point. So that is only completing the midterm and the paper, right? So to do this, we would take the first weight, right, is 40%, multiply times 60, right? We got 60 on the first midterm, and then plus 20% times 100, right? And then divide this by the 40% plus 20%, right? So we can plug this in the calculator really quick. So 0.4, oops, need to open up my parentheses, right? So let me insert this. So we have 0.4 times 60 plus 0.2 times 100 divide by, we'd have 0.4 plus 0.2. Right, so you get roughly 73.3, right, would be your grade. 73.3. Right. So part B asks now, what's the highest possible grade you can get in the class, right? So in other words, we still have exam 2 to take, but what's the highest possible grade that we could finish with given a 60% on midterm and 100 on the paper, right? So in other words, we just pretend that we got 100% on the exam 2. So we could actually just fill down what we have in part A so far, right? Because those are going to be the same, those weights and data points. What we're adding in, I'll write in green, right? So what we're adding in is we would have a 40% weight times 100 on exam 2, and then down here we have to add in that weight additionally, right? Oops. Right, so 40%. So then we can simplify this and get this answer. So I need to add in the top here 0.4 times 100, right? And then in the denominator, I need to add in here plus 0.4. Oops. That can't be right. I must have made an error. Let me just let me start over here, right? That's not right. So we'll do 0.4 times 60 plus 0.2 times 100 plus 0.4 times 100, and then divided by 0.4 plus 0.2 plus 0.4. There we go. That sounds much more reasonable, right? So 84%, right? So we got an 84. 84 would be the highest possible grade we could get, right? So that might give us some motivation, like I can still get a B in this class, right? So in the last problem, number 4, is looking at a Excel gradebook. So part A, we're given the screenshot and asked to answer some questions. So part A says, what formula is in cell B16, right? So if we notice, B16 is here, and we have this title average, right? Listed above. So, and notice we have a value 8 here, and then 7.825, and right above, this is for homework grades, these are for quiz grades. So it appears that this 8 is averaging the scores on the 12 homework grades, right? So the formula that you would want here, right? We could do equals, and we could just use the average function in Excel, and then the range that we want to go through is what, B3 to B14, right? So that is the formula that's in cell B16, right? So in part B, it says, what is the student's grade in the class right now, right? So what you want to pay attention to is what assignments have we done so far, right? So we've completed these homework scores, we've completed these quizzes so far, right? And then also we have one of these projects completed, right, with the 8% weighting, right? So you can see the assignment type and also the weighting listed for all of these, right? So then, in order to use our formula, right, on the previous page, right, where we're taking the data times the weight for each case, and then dividing it by the total number of weights that we have. So for part B, what you'd want to do is notice that here this is 93, and all of these appear to be out at 10 points. This appears to be out of 100 points, right? So what I would do is just convert everything into like a percent, right? So in other words, what you'd want to do is take all these homework grades and multiply by 10. Same with the quizzes, right? So when I work with the average of the homework grades, I want to think of this as 80, right, times 10, right? And the and for the quizzes, 78.25, right? So again, we want to think of these as percentages, right? So this average means I got an average score of 8 out of 10 points on the homework, right? So if I take 8 divided by 10, I get 80%, right? So that's where that 80 is coming from. And this 7.825, right? Again, this is the average score that you got out of 10 points. So if I take that and divide by 10, you get 78.25%, right? And here, since this appears to be out of 100 points, this is already a percent. This is 93. Right. So now we're in good shape to start. So to do this, I would first take your homework grades, which are 20%. So we would take 20% times 80, right? And then plus, so the weighting of the quiz grades are 20% also. And then we would multiply that times the 78.25, right? That's the data value we have in for quizzes. And then plus, and then notice here it says 8% each, so each project is 8%. So we would have 8% times the one project we got 93 on, right? And then we would divide this by the sum of the weights, so divide this by 20% plus 20% plus 8%, right? So if we enter this in the calculator really quick, right, so we'd have 0.2 times 80 plus 0.2 times 78.25 plus 0.08 times 93, and then 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.08. Oops, I have a syntax error, so let's see what, oh, I forgot, wait, 0.2, let me see here, I might have typed something in. So we want 0.2 times 0.8 plus 0.2 times 78.25, that's right, and then plus 0.08 times 93, and then divided by 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.08. Yep, that's right. All right, so hit enter. We get 81, roughly 81.4, right? So that should be right. 81.4. So then C is, what will be her grade if she gets 100 on the next project and a 95 on the midterm, right? So I'm just going to add on to the part B, and I'll do this in another color, so maybe in red, right? So we just need to keep following along here and make a little changes, right? So if we got a 100 on the next project, right, this part, remember this 8%, this was my projects, right? And these are 8% each, right? So I could just add on plus 8% times 100, right? And then we got a 95 on the midterm. So if we look above, the midterms are 10%, right? So this would be plus 10% times 95, right? And then we need to add on our weights. So our new weights that we added on was we added an 8% weight and a 10% weight, right? So now all of this, right, all of this would be equal to, right, we can simplify this. So if we open up a calculator, so we take open up parentheses, so 0.2 times 80 plus 0.2 times 78.25 plus 0.08 times 93 plus 0.08 times 100 plus 0.1 times 95. Right, and this would be divided by 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.08 plus 0.08 plus 0.1. Right, and we get 85.7. Right, so for this last part, you should get approximately 85.7. All right, well, that's all I have for this worksheet.